everyone, and welcome back to Nonviolent International's YouTube channel. This is our Spotlight series where we talk with activists, scholars, and advocates leading the way in global action. My name is Rachel, and today I have the pleasure to interview Program Associate and Publications Coordinator at the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict, Bruce Pearson. Bruce has been described as a highly educated and skilled program and curriculum builder, and is passionate about bringing autonomy and power back into the hands of the oppressed. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today, Bruce.
I'm happy to be here. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Wonderful. And so during our discussion, I really want to cover three important aspects of your activism, kind of the influence of growing up in South Africa, the creative process behind designing and implementing training for nonviolence, and of course, how the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict uses Peter Ackerman's text to campaign for civil resistance.
That's great.
So during our discussion, we're definitely going to be talking about nonviolence. And so maybe you can start by explaining your role in nonviolent activism.
Sure, yeah. Well, I see nonviolent action and civil resistance as this effective tool to help reshape society so that people can secure their rights or freedoms or justice. And it's a dynamic, it's a social dynamic that I think is going to arise no matter what. Right, people get pushed towards the point of doing something for themselves or their communities to improve it, and so the key is what can I contribute? What can I do to help people do that more effectively? Right, because there's no guarantee when you're waging nonviolent struggle. But so what are the things that we know about it from looking at past struggles and from looking at like quantitative data and case studies? That we can share with people so that they can make the most informed decisions as they shape their own struggles. So I think I see myself as somewhat sort of a connector between resources and people. And on the one hand, that plays out with helping people learn about the resources that are already there, right? Whether that's through an online course or through publications, through videos that exist, help them to navigate what's there and to understand it better. And then, but also it's about creating more resources. So working with people as they share their own stories or their own research or their own specialized knowledge about resistance so that other people can benefit from what they have to bring. So I think that's how I see myself. And then I guess maybe a third way would be like improving things, improving those connections between people. So not just making those connections, but for instance, when it comes to training, like observing trainings and understanding how can these trainings be tweaked so that we can get even more out of them. So I see my role in that.
Yeah, you mentioned, connecting history. And so how did growing up in South Africa during the decline of the apartheid regime influence your research and really cultivate, this style of compassionate leadership you're talking about?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It informs a lot, and it's hard to convey the massive impact of that. In one respect, there's sort of the immediate would be like in my family, right? The experiences that I had in my family during those times. And before South Africa, my family was also in Zimbabwe, and before Zimbabwe was Zimbabwe, right? It was Rhodesia, and also a system that really took advantage of the greater population. And but my family set a really good example from the beginning. When my parents were married, their wedding was one that was racially diverse. It was integrated, for lack of a better thing, in 1970s Rhodesia. That was, and then they carried that through my life as a child, where we had people in our lives in South Africa who were not just from the same ethnic group as us. And so they created this baseline assumption of equality and value and love and respect for all cultures around you within our home. And so, the transformation started to happen because of these successful campaigners in South Africa. From internally, there's the second defiance campaign, which culminated in these agreements, and externally, like the boycott, divestment, sanctions movements. So you see in South Africa this like that civil resistance, that people power can really result in a changed society. But as a kid, my experience of that is suddenly like people that I knew outside of my segregated school were now in the same school as me, right? So very like concrete, small, but powerful and meaningful and important indicators that change was starting to happen. And so there wasn't a question for me growing up of the potential of civil resistance to be effective. That was already there, right? But with South Africa, we also see this good case that even after the symbolic win or the political shift, the groundwork has happened, you still need people to be working through organizing to continue to secure more rights and more freedoms, right? If the institutions have failed people, and the chances are that in the transition to a better, more just society, those institutions are still going to be lacking. And so you need extra institutional channels for people to be able to improve society. And that's what civil resistance is, right? You can create alternative institutions. People can work together to make systems that are lacking or to hold systems accountable. And we see lots of, in South Africa's story, we see movements rise and address various injustices. And I'm hopeful that it'll continue to get better and better.
You bring up such a great point with, the win does not end when you win. The win is still coming. There are huge transitions to be made. And does civil resistance kind of scaffold the transition? Or
Yeah.
when do institutions really start to take shape? Is it at the end, or is it through the entire process?
I see it as through the process, and civil resistance can hold those institutions accountable as they take shape. I think of here in the United States, if you look at Brown versus Board of Education, this fantastic win for desegregating schools. And then you see on the ground, a year later, 2 years later, 5 years later, this still isn't really taking effect in many places, because in local communities or counties or state level, there's entrenched resistance within the system. And so you still need things outside of the institutions to make that happen practically, and not just like on paper, in the law, in the courts of law, but actually like on the ground in reality. And so, in the best case scenarios, people organizing creatively and strategically can help to change that reality, to bring it to catch up to what's been changed on paper, right? I mean, if you think of like the story of rights in the United States, there were so much of the groundwork for rights that we have now was laid in the 1860s and 1870s, but they weren't actualized until 100 years later or 150 years later. And that's what people can do.
Absolutely. And you mentioned your family and you mentioned kind of early childhood education, but I've also heard that you're interested in music and have quite a few insights on musical arts. So do you ever apply that to nonviolent education?
Yeah, I think the first way that comes to mind is that music is a powerful cultural element. And if you look through history, you have seen songs be an important part of movements, right? And when I think of the 1960s in the United States, I think of the freedom songs and how these helped people stay courageous in very challenging environments, or kept them focused on the objective of their mission, right? Songs were used very effectively, but also popular music, not just what you might consider folk music, the music of the people as they're singing, marching down the street, but popular music in the sense of what people are listening to on the radios, also took hold of this spirit of reform and transformation that was happening in society, and provided a soundtrack. And we've seen like the singing revolution, and and different historical things where music has played a big role. So there's that element of it. And when I work with people who are going through a course on civil resistance, I love to bring that up because it helps people think about the creative actions outside of maybe just a protest or a march, right? The very visual things that we make almost exactly the same as civil resistance, even though it's just sort of this like one tactical choice, right? But like writing a song and bringing that song into society or into a community can do a lot. The other thing that I think of with music is it's more abstract, artsy, but as a musician, I think of, I don't like to be too reductionist, but were I to reduce music to like its bare essentials, music is it's tension and it's release, right? There are moments when things get stressed, and there are moments when that stress is let go. And I think that most art, you could argue, has that dynamic in some way, whether it's, you know, visual, a painting, there's the, in the composition, there's like pieces where there's tension and pieces where there's space, or architecture. But that dynamic is also a very social dynamic. And I think when people are planning a strategic campaign, they need to think, what are the moments that we increase the stress, and what are the moments that we let the release happen, right? So how do we calibrate a strategic plan that harnesses this idea of well-balanced art so that you have stress and you have release? That's if that makes sense. That's where my mind goes when I think of music and resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. And so now you have to let the people know what instruments do you play, what music, do you engage with?
Oh, I mean, I play bass. Bass was my first upright, and then electric and piano and electric organ. And if it has strings or keys, then I can do something with
Sounds great.
it. Yeah.
And you mentioned tactics. And so I want to kind of dive into your work at, the Center for Nonviolent Conflict. And so, as a collection of tactics and strategies, what role does Peter Ackerman's text play in teaching people autonomy and shifting power dynamics?
Yeah, that's really good. You know, Peter was the founder of ICNC, and he passed away just a few months ago. And but in the last year, it was last year that his book came out, and since then we've been working on it as, the ideas within the book as a training method. And so this is the checklist exercise, the checklist to end tyranny, right? Which presents this idea of the checklist exercise for freedom. And this idea is that at its core, a group of people who are in a struggle understand their struggle better than people who are outside it, right? And this is a guiding principle at ICNC, right? We might have a deep knowledge and a deep passion individually for a specific country or region, and we are reading and learning and studying and teaching about civil resistance itself every day. But despite that, none of that replaces the validity and the expertise of someone that is in the field living that struggle. And so with that in mind, our training model isn't built around this idea of if we come in and we're going to tell you what to do, right? We're going to be your savior. And if you just take these steps, everything's going to be okay. That's very careless, because you're playing with people's lives, right? You don't know what risks they are up against. You don't know the hard decisions that they have to make. So our framework is such that we want people to just think critically about their circumstances. And so the checklist is framed as a series of questions so that people can understand sort of their internal capabilities, but also their external realities better. And so it's guided by, over 50 years of Peter Ackerman working in this field, as well as the ICNC team, the Albert Einstein Institute team before that, and so many partners and groups from different, it's a huge, it's a culmination of a lot of work of people identifying what are the things that movements really need to think about. And so in this checklist, we ask about, is the movement unified, right? Unity is a really core thing. Like, are they able to work together? Is a movement strategically sequencing their tactics and diversifying their tactics? Or is it just tactics happen when we feel the urge and we keep doing the same one because that's what we know, right? Are we thinking critically about our tactical choices and how we are arranging them to achieve a certain goal or to target certain things? Is the movement maintaining nonviolent discipline, right? Is it prepared to face the challenges of violence in the face of nonviolent action? Or is it prone toward becoming violent or developing violent flanks? Or is it vulnerable to agent provocateurs who are people who are planted in movements to try to make them more violent? So we look at those three things. We also look at participation. Is a movement maximizing participation? Is it diversifying participation? Or is it everyone from the same religious organization or the same workers union or the same political party or the same civil society organization, whatever it might be, right? Are we seeing women and men? Are we seeing a diversity among sexual preference? Are we seeing age diversity? Are we seeing people who are only like blue collars? Are we seeing white collars as well? Right. So the greater cross section of society that you can get as a part of your movement, the more informed it's going to be based on the needs of society and not just the needs of the few, and the better that it can, help shape a better tomorrow. But also the more effective the campaign will be in achieving its goals. So we look at those four things, and then we look at, we ask them, what is their read on the oppressor's use of repression? Is it going to increase, decrease? Are they going to be more emboldened and think that repression is going to work? Are you thinking about how to make that repression backfire? Right. So there's questions about repression. There's questions about defection. Right. What are you doing to maximize defectors from the regime? How are you chipping away at those pillars of support? Right. And that's one thing, arguably, that nonviolent action has for it that armed resistance doesn't have, because to steal the words of Peter Ackerman, he liked to say, people are not prone to defect when you're pointing a gun at them, right? They're not prone to join your side if they think that you're going to hang them as soon as they stop fighting against you. So there's that. And then there's the questions of external support. What are movements doing to maximize external support? And to get the most out of it. And then finally, what are movements laying the groundwork now so that when the struggle is over, this is going to be a more equitable society? This is going to be a society where people's voices matter? Or is the campaign being run in a way where, injustice is going to be entrenched, but just in a different shape? Right. So these are like eight so our overarching ideas that our trainings move people through to be able to recalibrate if needed, and to think more critically about the actions that they're taking. So yeah, does that get to sort of what you're asking?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, nonviolent resistance is intense and it's joyful. There are moments of tension and release. And so, during your work, what is something that you find is hopeful in preparing future activists?
Well, something that I've seen, and we've worked with people who are in very entrenched situations where they might come to a training with very little hope. This idea that, well, we've tried everything. Like, what can we possibly do next? And I think that that's a very reasonable feeling to have for some of these situations that people have been in for decades, where they've been against the same regime for decades, and where their freedoms are not just restricted, but are getting worse. Mm. And after spending 48 hours with groups of people who are in these circumstances, with them sharing their ideas with each other, with them talking to people who maybe they hadn't been talking to before, seeing their willingness to collaborate more, and the increase in their hope and their sense of tactical options is incredibly inspiring, because if people in entrenched political situations are seeing options, in the worst of the worst situations, if they're seeing options to improve their society and to bring freedom to more people and to establish rights that are missing, then that option should be available to all of us. And that's really hopeful to me. And we're at the report, the Freedom House report, what was 16 years of democratic decline and authoritarian increase around the world. That's a long stretch. And if the people in the toughest situations are more hopeful after spending a few days together, a couple days together, working on ideas and plans, then we all have a lot to hope for.
Thank you so much. And Bruce, do you have any remaining thoughts and or advice you would give to those wanting to get involved in nonviolent resistance or start to just engage with the literature?
Yeah, there are videos on YouTube, like the series that you run. I've watched all of them. I love them. there are books. ICNC has a resource library that includes resources in over 70 different languages. Nonviolence International has a database of tactical options. You know, it's also, there's a book that ICNC put out that Michael Beer wrote that dives into these tactical options and presents frameworks for understanding them and navigating them. There's my colleague Ivan Marovic. He was one of the leaders of the uproar movement in Serbia, which was responsible for ending Milosevic's regime. And we have a guide for strategic planning. It's all free to download on our website, nonviolent-conflict.org. And yeah, so start reading. Read Minds of the Movement at ICNC's webpage. Read Waging Nonviolence. Read Rivera's Son's weekly compilation of everything that's happening in the world. I don't even know how there's time to compile all of that so thoroughly, but there's so much out there. And I think as you start to expose yourself to these different things, whether it's academic or whether it's like organizational, tactical planning, whether it's case studies and history, whether it's like the quantitative statistical stuff, you will get more familiar with the world and who operates in the world and how it functions. And I think the more you do that, the more you can find what place you fit in it, right? Not everyone is like the frontline charismatic leader, right? But you don't need to be that person, right? There's lots of different roles that you can take. And the more you read about it, the more you learn about it, the more you'll find the place that's right for you.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for taking the time to have this important discussion with me. And thank you to everyone for taking the time to watch my interview with Bruce. And if you want to learn more about Bruce, his work at ICNC, and other great things he is a part of, please check out the links in the description. I look forward to seeing more of your work.
Great. It's so good talking to you.
Thank you. If you think these conversations are important and would like to see them continue, please consider supporting NVI and the work we do by subscribing to this YouTube channel, following us on Twitter and Facebook, and visiting our website. Please consider donating to our organization and checking out our nonviolent training archive and database linked in this description. Every little bit counts to help build a more just and nonviolent world.